Hello, this is Aaron Wren, and today I have a very special guest. I say that a lot, but today it's doubly true, and that is Richard Reeves. He is the president of the American Institute for Boys and Men. He's a non resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and is the author of the influential book of Boys and Men: Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. I've got links both to the Institute and to the book to buy it in the show notes. Richard, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on, Aaron.
And this book really has made a splash. It's a very important book. That's what we're really going to focus on today is the book and, of course, your work with the Institute. But I noticed from your accent that you moved here from the UK. And so you had a think tank career there. And I believe you worked for Liberal Democratic Party leader Nick Clegg, I guess is his name, for a while. What brought you to the United States?
Yeah, so you're right. I'm a recovering Brit and a recovering politico in that sense. My last job in the UK was in the coalition government, working under David Cameron and Nick Clegg, specifically as Nick Clegg's director of strategy. But the short answer, the two-word answer is American wife. I have a wife who grew up, is from just north of Baltimore and came to London for work, having vowed actually that she would not marry and certainly wouldn't have children. And back she came with both 15 years later, I guess. And definitely she wanted to kind of move back. But also, frankly, I felt like I wanted a new challenge as well. So we came as a very American story because neither of us actually had jobs. We just got on the plane and assumed we'd be fine once we landed. And I was fortunate enough to find myself at the Brookings Institution. But that definitely wasn't something I had, with my plane ticket. And so I managed to get in there, and I spent 10 years at the Brookings Institution working on inequality issues, social mobility issues, the future of the middle class, etc. And that's really my work has really been driven by both in government and out, and in academia and out, around trying to identify obstacles to kind of upward mobility and human flourishing, and see if there's any way that we can address them either through policy and or culture.
Yeah, so your previous book was called Dream Hoarders. And if I summarize it, it's really how the upper middle class has essentially done very well and maybe pulled up the ladder after themselves, monopolizing opportunity. I think it's hoarding the American dream in a sense. And I definitely see the thread that connects that sort of opportunity gap with of boys and men. How did you specifically decide to dial in on men's issues?
Well, so after I'd done the work on the opportunity hoarding of the upper middle class, I think there are various ways in which elite Americans rig the system to their benefit, and then deny they're doing so and camouflage it under the idea of meritocracy. And I guess I found it particularly irritating that kind of self-described liberal upper middle class Americans are often the worst offenders. So they had the right signs in their yard, but they were very opposed to affordable housing and strongly defending legacy preferences and so on. Like just the housing market and the higher education market just strongly distorted in favor of people who have the kind of wherewithal. But because of that, I'm very interested in the ways in which structures influence opportunity. In that case, it was about class. But the more I looked into the issues about opportunity and inequality in the US, the more I found myself kind of running into data points where it was really boys and men who were struggling. And that didn't seem to me to be getting either enough attention or the right kind of attention. In other words, it wasn't getting serious attention. It might have been getting attention, certain corners of YouTube or from certain influencers who I know you're very interested in, Aaron, but it wasn't getting scholarly attention. It wasn't getting policymakers' attention because it went against the grain in terms of how I and we typically think about gender equality. And that's what led me to write the book and ultimately to create the Institute. There was something of a gap in the intellectual marketplace, if you like, for work on boys and men.
Yeah, well, there certainly, I think, was a sense that there was kind of a malaise affecting young men. You'd hear a lot of women writing articles about how, complaining about young men that they don't seem to have a lot going on today and different things like that. But you really put a lot of I think, statistical meat on the bones of what's going on. So, can you just tell us a little bit? What are some of the troubling challenges that young men and boys are facing in America today?
Yeah, so perhaps let's start at in a sense, definitely not the most numerous, but the most tragic end of the scale, which is around mental health and specifically the risk of loss of life to suicides or indeed drug overdoses. And so the US has seen a rise in suicide rates, but almost all of that is accounted for by the much higher rates among men. And just recently, the suicide rate among men in their 20s overtook that of men in their 50s. So historically, it's been more middle-aged men, but the rise since 2010 among young men under the age of 30 has been more than a third. It's been a 40%
Wow.
rise in suicide rates among those men. And just to put that, those are obviously rates. So to put that in a kind of more absolute context, 40,000 men a year that we lose to deaths from suicide, and that's about the same as the number of women who die from breast cancer. Just to put it in context, not to compare them as public health problems, but and then if you just, I was very recently actually looking at some data that CDC do on years of lives lost to deaths from non-natural causes before 65, and each year we lose about 1.5 million years of life, potential life, to drug overdoses alone
Wow.
among men. And actually, we lose more men, I should say, more male life years to drug overdoses than we do in total from all causes for women. So these huge gaps in healthcare, and then in the education system, it's more of a relative story, I would say, where it's just you've seen this huge overtaking of boys and men by women, and in some cases an absolute decline. So declining male college enrollment. There's a bigger gender gap on college campuses in the US today than there was in the 1970s, in the early 70s when we passed Title IX and had a big push for gender equality, but it's the other way around. So women are further ahead of men today in higher education than men were ahead of women when we passed Title IX in 1972. And that reflects what's happening all through the K-12 system. 2/3 of the best high schoolers by GPA are girls. 2/3 of those struggling most are boys. In the average school district in the US, the boys are almost a grade level behind in literacy skills, and there's a dead heat in math now. So those are just, I could obviously go on, but there's the kinds of figures that are just lying out there in the data sets and sometimes are at least noted, but they're not being taken seriously enough as gender inequalities that should be on the policy agenda because they go the other way from the way we normally think about gender gaps.
Yeah, well, your book certainly got a lot of attention, and it's an important book from this standpoint. As you said, there were some people talking about this, but they tended to be political conservatives or sort of social conservatives. And so you coming at it from, the Brookings Institution, which is the premier center-left think tank in America, really puts it on the agenda, I think, in a way that someone who would be more perceived as a neoconservative or something like that might do it. So I think it's really, there is this, I think, in America, this sense, unless both parties agree on something, it sort of gets partisan coded, and then it becomes a completely polarized issue we can't address anymore. So it's really important that we not partisan code some of these issues, because they really shouldn't be, I think, in a great extent, but too many of them are. So I think
or at least could we defer the disagreement to the discussion about causes and solutions rather than the basic facts, right? And so I think you're right in your characterization. In fact, I draw on the work of many conservative scholars on this subject, kind of in my book. And a criticism that I have received a little bit from some conservative quarters is like, well, welcome to the party. We've been talking about this for a long time. And I think, I understand that criticism. And I do think you're right that it kind of matters who's talking about these things as well as whether they're being talked about. And I agree with you. I don't think this should, in and of itself, be any more of a partisan issue than, say, what do we do about mental health issues, or what do we do about productivity? Like, is higher productivity a partisan issue? Like, it shouldn't. For me, these should be more technocratic issues than culture war issues. But I would say my main criticism of the most of what had gone before from the more conservative side of the aisle is that even when there was a good job done of identifying some of the problems, there was not much in terms of solutions, because of course, actually, that would require perhaps some policies, or it remained very much in the cultural sphere. And so my criticism of some of those previous books, even when I've drawn on them and admire them, is that they were sometimes a bit like the secular equivalent of the Book of Lamentations.
Right.
Yeah, there's lots of lamenting being going on about boys and young men for a long time. And what I tried to do was put forward some solutions, some of which people agree and disagree with. But at the very least, then we're having a discussion in the solution space rather than just in the problem space. And I think that too many conservatives have got themselves stuck in the position where they're very, very good at saying how terrible everything is for men now. But when you turn to them and say, and what should we do about it? The solutions tend to be a bit thin.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about some of the solutions there. And while I probably differ from you on some of them, one thing I agree with is that we're not rolling back the clock to the 1950s. So I do think there is this part of the conservative approach has been to tell men, you just need to start acting like men used to act back in the 1950s. You know, act like Ward Cleaver. There's a video from a National Review guy, you know, be more like Ward Cleaver. I'm like, well, you know, we don't live in that society anymore. The society's different. So the solutions can't be to, you know, prospectively impose social arrangements and behavioral patterns from a bygone era that don't necessarily apply today. What does it look like in the 21st century? What do you see as some of the causes of these gaps?
Well, I first of all want to underline what you've just said. I think it's absolutely true that's one of the problems of the debate, is that there is a back to the future feel on the right, but a sort of ignoring of it on the left. One of the things I fear is that the right want to turn back the clock, not least on women, and the left are just turning their backs on boys and men altogether. And too many young men feel caught in some ways between one set of messages, which is exactly as you say, it's like, be like your father, be like the old days, you know, be a real man again. And then too many on the left are saying, well, you should just basically be more like your sister. And your problem is that you're just, you know, the problem is that you're a guy. And so masculinity itself might be toxic. And so if we could just, you know, eradicate all that masculinity in you, then you'd be okay. So it's like, either be an old-fashioned man or stop being a man. And those are unpalatable choices for men who are men, but who are living in a world of gender equality, and especially in a world where women, and young women above all, are, in my view, rightly insistent on equal opportunities, equal rights, equal economic power. So it doesn't get you very far. So even if men decided, well, we want the world as it used to be, you know, where we can be the breadwinner and the head of the household, and women can raise the kids and stay at home, and that worked really well, let's go back to that world. The problem with that view is it doesn't require you only for men to agree with that view. It requires women to also agree with that view. And as I look around, I see a very, very limited supply of women who are desperate to go back to the 50s. And so it falls directly flat on its face just as a strategy. But I do think it speaks to your question, which is like, what's the cause of this? Because even if you applaud the economic rise of women, which I do, I think it's naive not to recognize that the economic rise of women, which has led to, for example, the fact that 40% of women now earn more than the median man, right? So that's not 50%. So that doesn't mean full catch up. But in 1979, it was only 13% of women who earned more than the median man. So in the space of just 4 decades, we've gone from a world where only a relatively small number of women were even earning more than the typical man to one where 40% are. And 40% of breadwinners are women now. Some of those are in single parent households, which we might get to, but that's a completely different world. And what it's done is it's unbundled the contract that used to be a very powerful one binding families together, which was, I'll put it bluntly, it was the economic dependency of women on men and the emotional dependency of men on women. That was kind of the deal, and it kind of worked. There were many problems with it, like men didn't develop enough emotionally and women didn't have enough economic independence. With the unbundling of that, which was the big push for the feminist movement, of course, of the post-war feminist movement anyway, that leaves a big question mark around, okay, what does it mean to be a man then? What does mature male success look like absent that old deal? So we've torn up the old script for masculinity, which was based around economic providing and so on, but we haven't replaced it. And the result is men without a script, men improvising, men uncertain, men vulnerable to simple solutions. And I think we have to have a lot of empathy for the fact that this is a difficult era of transition without saying, as so often happens in eras of transition, well, can't we go back? Can't we go back?
Right.
No, we can't. We've just got to go forward better.
Mm-hmm. So you think some of this is rooted in those social changes?
Yeah.
What role does economic change around, particularly deindustrialization?
Yeah.
Do you attribute a lot to that, or is that a red herring?
No, I think there's some of that's true. I think it tends to be a bit overstated. So you can find very good studies, for example, finding the impact of deindustrialization and trade, especially on kind of working class men. There's some truth to that, but it can only account for a small amount of what's happened to some of the employment rates of men. I think it's more a deindustrialization story than a globalization story. But yeah, the way I think about this is that you've sort of seen these two shocks happen almost simultaneously. One was more of a cultural and social shock, which was the economic rise of women. And to be clear, I mean a shock in like a good way. So suddenly, the massive rise of women, which totally changed the terms of trade economically between men and women, culturally speaking. And at the same time, just a hammer blow to the economic prospects for working class men, especially. And I think it's important to say that a lot of what we're talking about here is much more for working class and black men, which we might get to. But, it's not for nothing that the wages of men who don't have a college degree have basically been flat, for 40 years, and that, men in the middle of the distribution aren't going to earn more than their fathers did. Those are big changes. And it's not because women have gone into the labor force. I think that's the mistake a lot of people make, is a kind of version of the lump of labor fallacy, which is they think, well, it's because women have gone to work, right? And they've displaced all the men. It's not because of that. It's because of these unrelated shocks around automation, deindustrialization. But I do think it's been an unfortunate coincidence of a set of economic blows on the one hand, and then a massive cultural transformation on the other hand, which has honestly left many men, especially those with less economic power, reeling and uncertain of their position and role in society. I think downstream, that's what leads to a lot of these deaths of despair and a lot of this retreat that we see among many men.
Another book that came out, I think, a bit after yours that got a lot of attention was called The Two-Parent Privilege by economist Melissa Carney, who I think is also a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, and really documented in pretty stark form the vast gap in fortunes between people raised in single-parent households versus, in a home, intact home with their own two parents. And it seemed like there were some gendered things there, especially around black boys who seem to suffer profoundly when they don't have their father in their home, or if they're in a neighborhood without a lot of intact families with fathers. And so we have a 40% out of wedlock birth rate now, which, there used to be very few of those. Fortunately, It's not going up, but we're at a very elevated level. And again, divorces come down from peak, but it's still around 40% divorce rate. How much does essentially family breakdown or non-traditional family structures, or whatever your preferred term would be, play in these issues with young men and boys?
So I think it's playing a very significant role, but I would probably describe it in ways that are somewhat different to the ways in which Melissa describes it. I will also take the opportunity to advertise the fact that the American Institute for Boys and Men just published a very nice piece by Brad Wilcox, who has his own book out with the perhaps the more imperative title "Get Married" than Melissa's title. But and he writes a piece for us on why marriage is particularly good for men, economic, in terms of their economics and their health and their happiness. So the way I think about this is that it is quite clear, this is the agreement part, that parental engagement is hugely important to the outcomes of kids. And I would just add, side note, but not an unimportant one, and matters hugely for parents as well. But it does matter hugely. And that's true of fathers, as much as mothers, albeit in somewhat different ways. And so when we're talking about family breakdown, family fragmentation, what we're very often talking about is the lack of fathers in kids' lives. Right? Why don't we talk about motherlessness very much?
Yeah.
Why don't we talk about mother absence very much? Just because usually if the kids are with one parent, they're with the mum. And so that's just a brute fact in the sociology of the family. And I think it's pretty clear that lack of paternal engagement is bad for kids. It's bad for girls' mental health. It's bad for boys' educational outcomes, their chance of getting into trouble with the law. It's actually bad for teen pregnancy rates among girls. It's all kinds of clear. There's no argument now that dads matter in terms of their kids' outcomes. So then the question becomes like, is the only way, or what's the relationship between marital breakdown and the lack of parenting? And this is where I part company from Melissa and to some extent people like Brad too, which is I don't see any immediate prospect of returning to the world you just referred to where only 10% of kids were born outside wedlock. Not least because the main reason for this is Scott Winship's work at the Joint Economic Committee now, the single biggest reason for the rise in out of wedlock births has been the decline in shotgun marriages. And so this is just a different world where previously an unintended pregnancy was much more likely to lead to a marriage than today. I just don't see any plausible prospect of kind of bringing back the sort of, even if we wanted to, the social norms around that. And so I think we're living in a world now, at least for the foreseeable future, where we can't just assume that parents are going to be together. And then we've got to think about fatherhood mattering independent of the relationship with the mum, right? This is the main argument that I have with perhaps more social conservatives on this, which is they would say he's unbundling fatherhood from marriage. And the truth is that all the evidence points to the fact that if you want fathers to be good fathers, they have to be married, right? And I think they've got a lot of weight of evidence on their side so far. But I actually think, well, that's kind of the problem that we have to solve, which is how do we help fathers be good fathers anyway? And I'm not saying it's not easier when you're in the same home as the mother. Of course, it's better and easier. I don't think that's the argument. The argument is when that's not true, what do we do about it? And I fear that the conservative messaging around this ends up benching a lot of dads. So you mentioned the 40% figure born outside marriage, 70% for Black Americans. And I think the main reason that this is a bigger issue for Black children and especially for Black boys is because the numbers are just so very, very different. I don't see particularly strong evidence. There's a little bit of evidence, but I don't see particularly strong evidence that there's a massive racial difference in the impact of fatherlessness on kids. There's just a massive racial difference in the amount of fatherlessness for all kinds of reasons that we could talk about, incarceration and the employment prospects of Black men and so on too. But I think what sometimes looks like a race problem, I think, is really a family issue that's just at different levels in different groups. But my main takeaway from all this is dads matter. The question is, what's the role of marriage in making sure that dads remain connected to their kids' lives? And the strong conservative argument is, yeah, that's why marriage matters too. And my concern about that is that it's a bit utopian.
Yeah, I think if you go back to like 1950, the Black out of wedlock birth rate is lower than today's Black out of wedlock birth rate. White out of wedlock birth rate.
White.
Yeah,
that's right. That's exactly right.
They were they were lower than whites are today. So
that's right.
And
there's huge class gaps. I mean, you alluded to this, but class is playing a huge role here. I mean, the other thing that's really strong, I mean, Melissa's work shows this very well, but there was no class gap in marriage rates in the 60s. There is now a massive class gap in marriage rates. So upper middle class Americans come back to the dream, we're still getting married. Our kids are getting married, right? So the out of wedlock birth rate is still in single figures for people with 4-year college degrees.
Yeah, I think that's what Robert Putnam and our kids, went through similar those sort of class comparisons there. Yeah, you really get at something. I mean, there's really no prospect of we're not going to eliminate no-fault divorce or make it harder to get divorced. We're not going to bring back the industrial economy. I mean, there are policies that you could think of that could really move the needle on this, but most of them seem completely, unrealistic in terms of any prospect of getting influence. So what would you say we actually need to do that's realistic and can be done?
Yeah, so I think what we're doing is we're arguing about different kind of levels of optimism about two approaches. So my approach is lean hard into fatherhood,
Mhm.
invest in fatherhood programs. The evidence on their effectiveness is mixed, but that's better than the evidence on marriage promotion
Mhm.
policies, where the evidence is pretty blanket ineffective. um, and I would think about policies to support fathers. For example, this is obviously much more of a kind of liberal policy proposal, but paid leave for fathers, but it's dedicated to fathers. It's use it or lose it, to use the language of that
Mhm.
policy world. So dads have it. I think there's a case for looking harder at the way child support arrangements work and making
Mhm.
sure that they are kind of fair to both parents and that fathers are being kind of involved in that. I think involving fathers in the care of their children. And there's some messaging around this too. So my message is fathers matter, period. And I would invest in all and any policies and programs that support engaged fatherhood. I suspect, for what it's worth, that that would likely lead to more and or stronger marriages. I believe that if fathers saw how important their role is to their children, and if both fathers and mothers realize that raising your kids together and maybe even the same home is the best way to do it, that it's going to take two, that might lead to more thoughtfulness about having kids. It might lead to trying to be a bit more thought about who. No, I'm realizing this is a long-term policy, but just to make it more obvious to people that this is incredibly important to go about this the right way, I think that might lead to more marriage. Whereas the conservative view would be like, well, if we get more men to marry, they'll be better fathers. So in some ways, we're just arguing about the direction of the causal arrow. I think that one of the reasons for the decline of marriage is the decline of fatherhood. So if we reinstate fatherhood, that might bring more marriage in its wake. And I also think, and Melissa's book is very good on this, that there is more evidence, as I say, that there's more we can do tangibly to support fatherhood than there is to support marriage as an institution in and of itself.
Well, you could get at something that's one of the standard critiques of the upper middle class, that they do things like it practice high investment parenting, but they don't promote it. They don't talk about it. I mean, you open the New York Times, it's not glamorizing, married families involve fathers. It's glamorizing, the woman who just divorced her husband so that she could discover herself. Even churches, single mothers are heroes. Married mothers are never described as heroes. It's always
Right.
it says we're always elevating.
So
we're,
interesting.
we're always elevating things other. So is that something we could do? Is just simply, at least give at least as much airtime to like health as we do, or that sort of like involve fatherhood that we do to some of these other things.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right about the kind of hero thing. It's like, well, married women have it easy, right? So they don't get as much attention. I do think that both at a policy level and at a cultural level, it's at the very least important to be not anti-marriage, right? To see, I think the idea that sort of marriage is this. I actually wrote a piece of the Wall Street Journal ages ago on three reasons why it's harder for me to be against marriage, right?
Mhm.
And particularly if you're liberal, like you've had same-sex marriage, you've got kind of upper middle class people kind of marrying, more egalitarian marriages. I actually do think it's important kind of culturally that we're not falling a trap of seeing it. And I'll give you an example. Gloria Steinem got married, right? So at a certain point, and she said, I think now, she said, having been kind of against marriage if you read Gloria's earlier work on marriage, she has strong views on marriage. She's married. She married a guy.
Right.
Yeah, she's Christian Bale's father, which I love. Right. I have to tell you, when Gloria Steinem's getting married, that should make you think that maybe it's not such a horrible institution after all, and we've made some progress. But I agree with you that in certain cultural spaces, there's a reluctance to just portray marriage in a positive light. And the same is true in policy. So if there are marriage penalties in, say, the administration of benefits and so on, that's a very complicated issue. Then, of course, there shouldn't be penalties. I don't also think there should necessarily be kind of huge marriage bonuses. I don't think they work, and I don't think it's a good use of money. But I think we should be careful that we're not inadvertently either sending an anti-marriage message or doing that into policy. I will say something on the kind of not preaching what you practice point, though, which is, I don't know about you, I'd love your views on this, Aaron, but my sense of I don't think the appetite of working class Americans for a lecture from upper middle class Americans about how they should lead their lives is all that great right now. I'm not sensing huge receptivity to elites telling us how we should lead our lives among most American people right now. And so when people like Charles Murray and others say, well, you should preach what you practice, I don't know that now's the great time to be lecturing people from on high. I actually think people are a little bit sick of being lectured to from on high. Yeah. And so I worry about the tone of that message.
Yeah, I don't think you do it in the New York Times Sunday review section. You do it in the style section. I mean, that's where things happen.
Yeah,
that's where, like, I think, yeah, in Hollywood, yeah. You do it in like the way that people talk about. We do it a little bit. I think the Obama's marriage was portrayed very, very well.
Very well.
Just the way that people could, talk about their own, I think that's how it changes. It's like places like that. It doesn't change from lectures. Nobody's interested in a lecture, but people respond to what's glamorized on Instagram, and places like that. And so, unfortunately, that tends to select for kind of reality TV type things. But
there's something about modeling here too. And I actually wrote a piece for Yuval Levin's excellent National Affairs, which is published out of AEI. I called it Trickle Down Social Norms.
Yeah.
They actually think the way social norms spread is exactly through not just even Hollywood or Instagram, but I actually think that there's a lot to be said for, like, in the thick of daily life modeling, like what your neighbor does, what the person over the street does. And I actually suggested in that article that one of the downsides of the increasing segregation of our neighborhoods by class is that if you were in an upper middle class neighborhood, like the ones where my kids grew up, I'm just thinking on our street, and this is a very American thing, of course, I'm trying to think of a couple that wasn't married, right? In this incredibly elite, liberal, upper middle class. So all my kids knew growing up was everyone was married and everyone's friends were married. And so, and then in other communities, of course, there's hardly anybody that's married. And so maybe if our neighborhoods are a bit more mixed, if it turns out that being married is a good way of being in the world, then maybe other people will think, maybe I should do a bit more of that. This is the John Stuart Mill biographer and me coming out, which is a little bit about how norms really matter, but we tend to learn from each other, and good ideas win out and bad ideas don't. But how do we learn, like, what's a better idea? Could I do better than I am now? Or that guy seems to be really fit. Maybe it's because he goes running every day. Maybe I should run.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's one of those things where, like, you got to be modeled. And one of the things that I'm going to ask you about, we're coming up at the top of the hour, so I want to ask you about the American Institute for Boys and Men. About this, I'll just say, when my wife and I lived in New York City, we would, from time to time invite single people from our church to come over for dinner, which they're usually not included in, like, the social life of married couples often. And it's a chance to just show people how you live. And they can see what it's like to actually be married and what your apartment looks like and things like that. You can open up your doors, because I do think that married and single people tend to have their social lives tend to bifurcate after kids come, starting in the late 30s. And then they inhabit kind of parallel worlds. But yeah, tell me about what is your ambition for the American Institute for Boys and Men?
One of our internal mottos is to keep it boring. And as my son quickly said when I told him that, he said, well, you're the man for that job, Dad. But that speaks to the question. The goal for the American Institute for Boys and Men is to do good quality research and advocacy on behalf of boys and men in a non-partisan, rigorous way. That's the sort of classic mission statement. But I would say it more plainly to you now, which is that I hope to make the discussion of research into and addressing of the problems of boys and men into a straightforward, mainstream, non-controversial issue. I would like it to be part of the furniture. I would like it not to be something where people say, that it requires any courage, or that it is weird, or that it is looked on as an odd thing. Basically, it should be mainstream, where the data points to it. And we've talked about some of those data points today in actually the main areas I think we've covered very well in terms of family, education, mental health, and so on. We should just address them. I'd like a world where people will find it weird to think that there used to not be an American Institute for Boys and Men, where people will think it was odd that we weren't setting up task forces to address male suicide, and that colleges weren't creating men's resource centers, given that men are dropping out of college in such high numbers. Well, they'll look back and think, God, why did we ever think that was a controversial idea? And so with every passing year, I hope to make this I hope to make this issue more boring, more mainstream, more data driven. I want it as far away from the culture war as possible and just in the mainstream, because these issues are real. Everyone knows it. We don't have to turn it. I love the way you frame this. It's not a zero-sum game. We can do stuff for women and girls and boys and men. We should, and we will.
So I believe the internet address is aibm.org, and there's definitely a link to it in the show notes, once again, as well as a link to buy the book of Boys and Men. Now, you just got like a very big grant. Melinda French Gates just announced she was giving away $1 billion to initiatives for female empowerment. But as part of that, she gave at least a couple pretty sizable grants to organizations focused on men, one of which was yours. So I was thinking it was $20 million. I don't know if it's a grant to your organization or if you're merely in charge of investing it on her behalf. But can you tell me about that? Because that's a pretty big deal.
Yes, it's the latter. It's she's created these funds that she then gives individuals free reign, essentially, to direct as she sees fit. And most of them are, on the traditional side of the gender equality debate, focused around women's empowerment. Some very good ones and some very good people, but at least two of them are focused on the boys and men side. And I think that's a surprise. Obviously, from my perspective, a pleasant surprise to be given that opportunity to direct these resources to issues of boys and men. But it reflects a growing recognition on the part of many women's rights advocates that we do have to rise together, and that when men are struggling, that doesn't make life better for women. And that there are now issues that we do need to deal with on the kind of the other side of this debate. And so I do think that when someone of the stature and prominence as Melinda French Gates sends that signal, albeit in a package that's obviously still focused more on the traditional side of it, it's nonetheless an important kind of cultural moment. And for me, it's exciting not only because of the substance of it, but also because, you know what, if Melinda French Gates understands that it's appropriate to spend some time focused on boys and men, then perhaps more people will come to the same realization.
Right. And then my last question, just kind of in that vein, is what has been the reception that your work has gotten as you've taken it into some of these spaces that might not seem like traditional friendly territory for a message such as yours? So, Melinda French Gates work on women's empowerment, or you spoke at the UN Women's He for She annual conference. What has been the reaction from these types of groups?
One of the things that's interesting is the reaction from other groups. And so the more reactionary figures associated with what's called the men's rights movement, they hate it when I do that. I get lots of heat on social media. It's like, how could you go there? That's the citadel of the enemy, etc. Okay. And guys, you've got to take a win.
Right.
But in those actual spaces, and I mentioned Gloria Steinem earlier, I was lucky to meet with her, and we're having some discussions too. I did speak at UN Women He for She. My experience of this is that whilst in advance of the conversation, the mere fact of the discussion can cause some discomfort. People come to these things going, really? We're going to talk about boys and men? But by the end of it, I would say that the vast majority of people are, if not persuaded, they're at least open, because the data speaks for itself. If you're careful not to frame it as zero sum, if you're careful to say, of course, there's still more to do for women and girls in many areas, but there is also, it's an and if you say this is about just showing compassion, and there's not a limited amount of compassion to go around. And also if you can say, look, if boys and men come to the conclusion that really gender equality and this whole movement has never got anything to do with them, except possibly as trying to recruit them as allies or pointing out how toxic they are, then don't be surprised if they look elsewhere
Right.
for answers to the questions that they're struggling with. You create a dangerous vacuum. And usually framed that way, the message gets a good reception. What I find really interesting about this is it's very often more sort of mainstream, progressive, center-left institutions like universities, nonprofits, think tanks, who struggle a bit more to talk about it because they're worried that the UN Women or Gloria Steinem or Melinda French Gates funded organizations will come for them. But we're talking to them. So it's like people are looking over their shoulder for a critic who I don't think is there anymore, as long as it's done in the right way. And so there's a lag here where I was just at public university last week, and we're doing some work in the space. And well, we have to be careful about the politics of this and what the faculty will think, and what will the Democrats in our house, our house think. And I'm talking about all of this. I'm like, well, Gloria Steinem and Melinda French Gates are okay with it. So, like, I don't know who you're afraid of. And I think it's a general point, Aaron. Maybe it's a useful one. More generally, I just think we're kind of past a lot of this, the worst of this, and that people are afraid of folk devils now on both sides. I think that these kind of, it turns out, I think this is true of people really, sensible voices on the conservative side saying marriage is great, here's why I think it's great, whatever, or whatever. Right? You can say stuff, and as long as you're in good faith and you've got some facts and you're open to reinterpreting your views in light of evidence, I think there's a real appetite now for people just to be honest and compassionate, and not see everything as zero sum. Of course, I'm saying that in 2024. Let's see where we are in 2025. But that's very much the spirit that guides my work, anyway.
Well, good luck in being very, very boring.
I'm trying.
As you aspire,
watch this space
to be. And I do agree. If we could just get the facts to be accepted, I think broadly, that's like the first step. Then you can disagree about what to do about it.
Exactly.
Again, my guest today has been Richard Reeves. He is the president of the American Institute for Boys and Men. He's the author of the book Of Boys and Men, and you can find links to both of those in the show notes. Richard, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Aaron. Really like that conversation.